Engineer Gold Mines is focused on the exploration and development of the historic high-grade Engineer Gold Mine situated 32 kilometers southwest of Atlan, British Columbia. Engineer Gold Mines is fully permitted for surface and underground exploration with the drill program now underway. Engineer Gold Mines Limited trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol EAU. For more information, please visit us at engineergoldmines.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Dr. Stephen Malthouse. He's speaking to us from Denman Island, British Columbia. Welcome to the Goddard Report.
Thanks very much, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
Stephen, in October, you penned an open letter to the BC Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry. Can you tell us what was in the letter?
Well, the letter was really outlining how Dr. Henry and the Ministry of Health's policies for public health have been causing more harm than help for British Columbians. If we add up the number of people that actually died from COVID-19, the so-called pandemic, we see that that number pales in comparison to the number of people that have been injured by shutdowns, social distancing, isolation of people, long-term cares being locked up, and the elderly being kept in isolated confinement. That letter did was to try to point out that there are many things in public health policies that are not based on science or medical evidence.
Have you personally treated any COVID-19 cases?
Well, it's kind of hard to find a COVID-19 patient. There are hardly any around. We had lots of hospitals that were prepared for them, and in fact, in the early parts of 2020. I myself was taking a sabbatical, and then we all thought we were going to get this horrendous COVID-19 tsunami, and I got prepared to go back to the front lines and start to work and see patients. But that huge wave of death and destruction never came, and many of the hospitals became empty. But nevertheless, we were waiting for all those COVID cases. On the little island where I live, we had 3 people with symptoms, but they were unconfirmed COVID cases, and they got well. And so if you want to do a COVID study, it's pretty hard to find the subjects to put in it.
We're hearing rumblings of hospitals that have no COVID patients. What are you hearing?
That's exactly right. Right across the country, my colleagues, doctors who are working in these hospitals say, well, we had a couple of cases back in April, but since then the COVID wards have been empty. I know on Vancouver Island we have no hospitalizations for COVID here, and yet the hospitals are pretty much shut down. They only allow a very rare visitor. We had someone here who came off our island who was badly injured, and his wife couldn't get in to see him because the hospitals are shut down and people are all very anxious about COVID, but in fact there are no COVID-sick patients.
How important is it when you're in the hospital to have visitors? I know when I was in, I sure look forward to it.
Oh, it's so important. And it's important not just the fact of picking up your spirits, but people will have better outcomes if they have some love around them. You can't just sit there waiting for your meal and for someone to arrive in a hazmat suit, and that's your day. How terrible a situation is that? So the emotions that people have in the hospitals are so important for their immune system, and that was shown by studies with Norman Cousins and psychoneuroimmunology many, many years ago. So having visitors is a key point for people to recover from illness and to get well faster. Get them out of the hospital. But if we lock it down, people don't know what's going on. They have no idea of how their family is faring, and the family doesn't know how they're faring. And so both the family and the patient are going to suffer.
Are medical professionals aware of what's going on, but they're afraid to stand up and speak out for the people?
That's kind of hard to say. I don't think I have my finger on the entire medical profession, but I do have colleagues who are starting to realize that these policies that are being put in place by Ministry of Health here in BC, but really across the world, around the globe, do not relate to what is really going on in reality. In other words, we don't have a pandemic going on, and it's very, very unlikely we're going to have anything that looks like a second wave unless there are influenza cases that are tagged as COVID. And they're seeing this, and they're starting to think that, maybe we're being misled here. And in fact, we are being given what I would say called maybe lies of omission in the way the public health officers officers are presenting the material, and the media is doing exactly that too. They're only pushing the numbers in cases, not the number of sick patients.
We've done interviews with David Icke from davidicke.com and John Rappaport from nomorefakenews.com, and they've both said COVID-19 is 100% a hoax, but provincial and federal health officers are forcing draconian measures on people to stop the spread of COVID-19. So let's dive into COVID-19. What are your thoughts on this statement from Mercola.com? With COVID-19 fatality rates as low as they are, mandatory mask wearing, social distancing, lockdowns, and business shutdowns are not only ineffective but unnecessary, but these measures are also contributing to a global economic collapse. It appears the only justification for this strategy is to increase fear, tyranny, and transfer of wealth to the upper 0.00001%.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. McCullough 100%. He's right on the button there, and it does take some looking past or examining the statements of the experts and to come to your own conclusions. So I'm sure all these experts, David Icke, who's been talking about this for a long time, John Rappaport, and certainly Dr. McCullough are all saying the same thing, which is to examine the evidence for yourself. Stop trusting in the experts so implicitly without examining what they have to say, and make up your own mind, because all the information is out there to confirm everything that those three people are saying.
Let's get into the testing for COVID-19. What is the test for COVID-19 and how accurate is it?
Well, there are really two types of tests for COVID-19. I think we can right off the bat dismiss the antibody testing. It may show antibodies to something, but it doesn't tell you whether you have it or what the significance of it is really. So that's not been well validated. We can just dismiss that. But what we mostly are going to be focusing on would be, and what our public health is focusing on, is the PCR test, which is essentially a swab that is put into your nose, turned around, and trying to gather some material out of there, which hopefully has some RNA in it, which are the small, half building blocks of DNA. And they're also what we expect to be what we're calling viruses. And to take that RNA and then to magnify it, it's a bit like putting it on that swab material on a Xerox and then Xeroxing your Xerox, et cetera, and multiplying enough times that you can identify that RNA and where it comes from, and match it to the COVID-19 virus or SARS-CoV-2, and then the PCR test gives off a fluorescence, which tells you it's yes or no. But there are some real problems with that test, and that test is what the whole shebang is based on. Now, we have a PCR test which is not accurate. In fact, was never intended to be used for this purpose, for diagnosis of COVID or any other viral infection, which is exactly what the inventor, Kary Mullis, stated. Then the whole idea of a pandemic of COVID-19 is like a house of cards, really. And we have to carefully examine this PCR testing to get an idea of how we could be fooled in such a way that we even imagine that a pandemic is still going on.
What was the PCR test originally designed for?
Well, Kary Mullis got a Nobel Prize for this test, and he's come out and saying that it's definitely not designed to be used for looking or diagnosing viral infections. It has been used to magnify DNA for various reasons. If you take a little bit of DNA and then you magnify it and you can identify it, then you can use it in all sorts of forensic purposes. But what is clear is it's not a very good test to use for determining whether the person has COVID-19 or not. Even the CDC, in their instructions for it, say that they're going to ask you to amplify it through up to 40 cycles, and the experts that are using this test say that 20 to 30 cycles should be sufficient to confirm a positive sample. But also, it's being used under what is known as the emergency use authorization through the CDC and the FDA. And on all the inserts, they say after the emergency is over, stop using this, because it's only intended. This is not a validated test, and we're only kind of using it because we don't have anything else, and only in the case of an emergency. So as soon as the emergency goes away, we're going to be throwing that test out the window.
We'll have more with Dr. Stephen Malthouse right after this.
Value from success, growth in discovery, Golden Arrow Resources is a well-funded gold-copper exploration company with proven management and prospective properties in Chile, Argentina, and Paraguay. Golden Arrow trades on the Toronto Venture Exchange, symbol GRG, on Frankfurt, symbol G6A, and the OTCQB, symbol GARWF. For more information, visit us at goldenarrowresources.com or call Sean at 778-686-0135.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications, patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Dr. Stephen Malthouse. Doctor, the cold and flu season is considered the second wave of COVID. Are we likely to see people diagnosed with COVID when they just have a cold or the flu?
I think you can pretty much count on that. I think there is an agenda for us to have a second wave, even if we don't have a second wave of COVID. And one way of creating that, well, there are two ways really, but the first way is to call cases which are positive PCR tests as to identify them as sick people and to create the fear around having a lot of sickness out there, which is not real. And the other way is to, when we do have people come in with the typical colds and flus and are hospitalized, and every year we have people that die from infections, respiratory tract infections, and to label those based on a faulty PCR test as COVID-19 will be our so-called second wave. And I think there's another agenda behind trying to propagate this fear in our communities, which is mostly to make people do what you tell them to do. Fear is a great motivator, and you can just look around on the streets and see how people are still very frightened. But if you actually ask people, have you seen anyone who's sick? Everyone will say no. Do you know any COVID cases in the hospitals? They say no. If you talk to the doctors, they themselves are scratching their heads. Where are all these COVID cases we keep hearing about on the 3 o'clock news by Dr. Bonnie Henry?
Is the potential asymptomatic spread narrative being used to instill fear?
It would be extremely rare to have asymptomatic spread. And if you think about it, people walking around with a mask being afraid that even though they don't have symptoms, they still could be contagious and kill their grandmother or their sister or someone in their family or someone they don't even know just by being close to them and breathing on them. Well, that's the perfect way to, make a loop that's unbreakable about the idea that you're dangerous and you need to wear a mask and isolate yourself at all times. So it's a type of unending story that if you get caught in that narrative, you won't be able to get out. If you listen to the WHO, their lead there spoke initially saying they've followed lots of cases and groups and so far, and there was no asymptomatic spread of COVID-19. The next day, she must have got a call on the telephone because she retracted that and hummed and hawed her way through what appeared to be someone telling a falsehood that we haven't really studied that many and so forth. In the first interview where she said there was no asymptomatic spread, she was very confident. She's an expert in her field, and she talked like she knew what she was talking about. In the second one, it looked like someone had tapped her on the shoulder and say, we can't have that narrative of asymptomatic spread not happening, and you better walk it back, which she did. So it's a bind. If you think asymptomatic spread happens regularly, frequently, then there's no way that you can not think that you are a permanent walking body of contagion.
We're here rumbling some hospitals in the U.S. are financially rewarded for categorizing deaths as COVID deaths, even though the cause of death was a motorcycle accident, cancer, or a heart attack. Could this also be happening in Canada?
I can't say that from a personal perspective or my own knowledge that it's happening in Canada. I did hear the case of an ambulance paramedic who was called to a heart attack, and the patient did not survive, and they took the patient to the morgue of the hospital by the ambulance, and that the doctor signed this death certificate as the cause of death being COVID. And this I have from a reliable source. So it may be happening here that we're getting COVID deaths which are not COVID deaths. I find that that case, that particular example, rather extreme. But it may be that what we're seeing are really other types of infections. They're being misdiagnosed as COVID. because of the faulty PCR test. I don't think we're being incentivized like they were in the United States financially to write things off as COVID. I know the CDC is now walking that back and saying, many of these people did not have COVID. In fact, 130,000 of the 220,000 that died had something else that killed them. It could be happening in Canada, but maybe we're more subtle than they are in the United States.
We're hearing some symptoms of COVID-19 include blood clots in the blood vessels of the lungs and happy hypoxia. First, what is happy hypoxia, and could these be symptoms of other illnesses?
Well, I've never heard the term happy hypoxia before now. I don't think hypoxia is a happy thing, but what I believe it refers to is that people's oxygen levels in their blood can be extremely low, and yet they're still there talking or even, singing a little bit. That's this sort of disconnect. What is happening chemically and with regard to dropping their oxygen tensions in their blood, and how they're feeling is there's a disconnect there. But the people often deteriorate very quickly and become very short of breath, and they're intubated in many cases, particularly in the U.S. where they're using a lot of ventilators, because of that sudden decline. So it could be that they're walking towards a cliff and don't really realize that the cliff is coming, and then over they go, and they get very sick very fast. With regard to symptoms of other illnesses, well, again, we never really looked so closely at influenza and other respiratory infections to look for blood clots and everything that we're now saying is a characteristic of COVID. Because we didn't really look so closely before, there may have been many things such as, let's say, blue toes, which could have been related to that, and we just never saw it because no one was looking. The other thing is there are diseases such as glyphosate poisoning, cyanide poisoning from air pollution. Maybe even 5G is playing a part in making people more susceptible to disease. Those things, and nutritional deficiencies such as low vitamin D levels, which is very common at the time at April and March in the spring. Very common there that those deficiencies, nutritional deficiencies, may be contributing quite a bit to the appearance we're seeing here and the diagnosis of COVID. We know that people who had good or high vitamin D levels had a very, very low mortality rate, had fewer ICU admissions, and did better if they were admitted to the hospital. So there are many things playing a role here, and in fact it may be that COVID is not a hoax, but it may be something which is much milder than we expect. It's certainly not a pandemic level, even though it's theoretically between 1 and 2 level in the CDC pandemic severity score, but we may be seeing a whole bunch of things coming together, and we don't know how to separate them out, and we're just lumping them under COVID because that fits the narrative of a pandemic.
Did China overreact to it, and then everybody else in the world decided they had to do the same as China?
That's a very good question. It's hard to know what role China played in this, whether they overreacted or underreacted. It sounds like they closed their internal air flights, but they allowed to remain open the international flights. So it's hard to know what their motivation was. If we look at what's happening with the WHO and their top-down directives, we know that Bill Gates and China are the two top contributors financially to the WHO, and I'm sure they call the shots there. So what they did, what the strategy for spreading it or not spreading it was, it's very hard to say. But we can say that whatever their strategy that they did impose had the effects of putting the Western world far, far behind them in terms of manufacturing, and they're up and running, and we're not because of closures of businesses and the destruction of our economic system.
Yes, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says, well, most of the industrialized world will have negative growth next year. China's expected to boom by 10%.
Yep, and that's already been seen, that China's growing and the rest of the world is not. So it's a pretty good strategy to release a virus into the world and decimate everyone's economy. But you know what? We're contributing to that ourselves, our governments and our public health, and a lot of our institutions are doing it to ourselves. They're essentially attacking their own citizens. We don't need to have China doing it. We're doing it ourselves.
We'll have more with Dr. Stephen Malthouse right after this.
Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia and the Yukon, trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the OTCQB, symbol ABNAF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Dr. Stephen Malthouse. Doctor, are pesticides and pollution significant health risks?
I don't think there's anyone who would say they're not significant health risks. I would say that what we're looking at now, glyphosate in Roundup, is definitely a health risk, and some of the lung findings that we have been attributing to COVID, this ground glass appearance in both lung fields, which appears early in the disease. From that I mean that the people are still breathing quite happily even though they're starting to drop their oxygen levels. That's also a characteristic of glyphosate poisoning of the lung. We do know that glyphosate is water soluble. It's water going down the rivers, and there's a big dead zone outside of New Orleans. We also see that it's contaminated biofuels, and it's also in the water systems. And many of the places where trucks are using biofuel, they've been hotspots with COVID deaths. So there's no doubt that glyphosate plays a role. I think that 5G, which is being put up really as a means of infrastructure for surveillance programs to come for vaccination, and making sure people are able to be tracked, to have that broadband coverage, we need to have 5G. And 5G, from what I've read, I'm not an expert on this, it does have effects on the human body, and particularly with regard to the water molecules. So, yes, pollution in many forms and pesticides are definitely playing a role here, and worsening anything we think is just simply an infection by a virus.
Let's talk about the masks. Almost 100 years ago, the Spanish flu killed 25 to 50 million people. We're seeing on the internet that most of those people likely died from bacterial pneumonia from wearing masks. Could this be history repeating?
Well, as doctors, we're looking out for a virus infection all the time. So often we'll send someone home, or there are cases of people being sent home when, in fact, they had a bacterial infection. And we've been kind of putting some blinkers on. Everything is COVID. So we're missing some of the other more obvious diagnoses that we would have made if we hadn't been so programmed just to look for one thing. Wearing a mask does not work. We know that. Over the last 2 decades, they have not been able to find one RCT study that has validated clinical outcomes to show that masks reduce the infection and contagion of viruses. So let's just throw your mask out. All it does is muzzle you and increase your breathing of low oxygen level, high carbon level atmosphere. And if your mask is getting wet, and if you've got an early infection, you can imagine breathing that in and out is like breathing from a petri dish of bacterial or viral infection. Masks don't work. They don't prevent the transfer of aerosolized virus, which comes out the side, the tops, and the bottom of your mask. You only breathe maybe about 30% of the ventilatory air through the mask material itself. Most of it comes out through the gaps around the side. And it can linger in the air for 1 to 3 hours, and it can go in a plume for about 26 feet by research. So we need to discard this idea that masks work for us in these viral infections. We know the coronavirus is 0.1 microns in size, and those masks only can screen 0.3 microns and up. That's an N95 mask. So there's no sense in wearing one if you think you're going to block this. If you're stuck with the old paradigm of droplet spread only, then you might think it would do something, but even in the operating room, we've shown pretty clearly that wearing a mask when you're doing an operation or not wearing a mask makes no difference in the number of wound infections and infections in general in surgical practice. So I think we need to get rid of the mask. They're not doing us any good, and psychologically they are extremely harmful, particularly to children.
Do face masks cause oxygen deprivation, and can this lead to health issues?
It's been shown by OSHA, which is the United States organization which looks at safety in occupational settings, and they know that the oxygen tensions go down in masks to about 17% from 21%, and also that the CO2 levels just skyrocket way up into the urgent get out of this room level. And if you're doing that breathing in and out, there can be two effects. One is that you might have an acute drop of oxygen or hypoxia, in which case you might faint, strike your head, cause yourself an injury. That's part one. But often the brain can get used to that in most people, and then you develop what's called chronic hypoxia, and that leads to neurological problems. And you don't have to be an old person to experience that. We will see, however, at least according to German neurologists, that dementia and other neurological illnesses, brain injuries, and so forth will get worse much quicker if they're not getting oxygen on a regular basis at the levels we hope to have. In other words, chronic hypoxia is going to cause neurological problems to accelerate.
Face masks cause people to rebreathe their exhaled air. Is that a concern?
Oh, of course it is. Just as I mentioned, your exhaled air is going to have lots of things in it, particles that your body is trying to get rid of, but also you're trying to get rid of carbon dioxide, and as that builds up and you breathe it back in, it has effects on diminishing your immune system, so your ability to fight off infection will be decreased. But also you will get headaches and you'll feel unwell, and you may find that your ability to function is decreased. I would think that if you're working around machinery or driving a bus with school children on, you might think twice about having a mask on. If you're susceptible to slightly decreased levels of oxygen and increased carbon dioxide, you could be in a dangerous situation. Again, the association, OSHA, that looks at this would not recommend that you wear a mask for any extended period of time, and only under certain circumstances, and also after you've been fitted for a mask and your ability to withstand the changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide based on your general health and physiology.
Is the inhaling of mask fibers a concern?
Probably is. There is some evidence that if you increase your ventilation, in other words, you breathe harder through a mask, that the mask fibers do start to break off from the inside of the mask, and there have been some electron microscopy studies which have shown that. So, yes, that is a problem. There is also a thought that masks can be treated, and some are treated with chemicals which can be toxic to humans in an effort to protect them from during transportation and storage. So again, that would be another tick against mask wearing.
Sure. Are they sprayed with things that might stop fungus or mold from growing on them, but then you're inhaling that chemical? That's
exactly right. Yeah. So another reason not to wear a mask.
Are there any scientific studies on the health risks of wearing masks?
Well, that's a good question. Most of those studies have tried to look at can you protect someone else if you're wearing a mask from a virus getting to them. And in the last 2 decades, we haven't been able to come up with any studies that are of high quality to show that. But many of them are not looking at infections that are created by you rebreathing your own material and so on. There was some evidence in hospitals with masked healthcare workers that they had increased colds and respiratory tract infections, but personally I haven't seen a lot of study done in that area.
Can mask wearing impair your immune system?
Well, again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, if you're wearing a mask and your carbon dioxide goes up, that would cause you to have an impaired immune system. But the other point is that when you see people wearing masks all around you, it's known as being like a billboard for fear. People subconsciously think that there's something dangerous about them out there and waiting to get them if they see everyone else wearing a mask. So it's a subconscious perception of danger. And we know that psychoneuroimmunology points out that when people have certain emotions, that affects their immunity and ability to fight off infection. And this is a good example. Being fearful is not good for you in so many different ways, and one of them is your ability to fight off infections. The more frightened you are, the less likely you'll be able to do that.
Does it look like the mask-wearing recommendations have nothing to do with decreasing the spread of the virus, but more to indoctrinate people into submission?
Well, that's what I would say was the agenda here, is to get the people to do something which is not based on science or medicine. In fact, is somewhat absurd. If you watch people and then using, when people do that sort of thing and you look at them and say, okay, they're following this rule, even though it doesn't make sense and it's pretty obviously a silly rule, then what's our next rule going to be? How about we lock everybody down based on case numbers made from a PCR test, which is inaccurate, never intended to be used for diagnosis? Hey, how about that? And then what comes after lockdown? Well, we start off with a small lockdown, bigger lockdown. How about not having any people come to your house? How about isolating seniors? What can we get away with? And the start is getting people to wear a mask when the recommendations don't make sense. Yep, I think it's for indoctrinating people into submission.
Could we be getting more eye infections from wearing masks? I have one that just won't clear up, and they won't let you into a store or some restaurants unless you have a mask on.
Yeah, well, there are two questions there. To be allowed into stores and restaurants without a mask, I would say yes. If you have people wearing masks, they're more likely to be harboring infections by, breathing and so forth, what's supposed to be coming out and creating infections, and then people are not wearing masks. But with regard to eye infections, if your breath is, again, coming up from the top of your mask, as they do in all the masks, they're not well fitted, you'd have to crazy glue it to your face to make it work. If your air is coming up through that way, what you breathe out, and you're creating an infectious atmosphere inside your mask due to moisture, heat, and rebreathing, then you can see that the chances of infections going up your face. We see that with staphylococcus infections that are now appearing in literature with people wearing masks, that your risks of having an eye infection are going to be higher. Yeah, so a mask could lead to having an eye infection. Whether you have styes, that again could be caused by inflammation, which is then a blocking of the ducts that lead from the glands and the eyelids, and that could lead to something like a stye.
If everyone decided I'm no longer wearing a mask, would the COVID narrative come to an end?
That's a good question. They'd have to have looked into the reason that they're no longer following the dictates of our public health specialists or experts. And if they did that, then they would recognize that there's much besides just mask wearing that is not telling the story and is trying to coerce them into following the plan. If they got to that point, then I think yes, I think the COVID narrative would come to an end. It would have ended.
CTV News reported that Saskatchewan is detaining people for failing to comply with self-isolation orders at a Regina facility, basically a prison for COVID. Does this make any sense?
I don't think we need a prison for COVID, do you? I mean, putting people into solitary confinement because they're testing positive with a PCR test, that's ridiculous. And I'm sure it's against the Constitution and our rights and freedoms.
Claire Edwards has written a paper entitled The COVID-19 Genocide of 2020. Could this happen and be a result of masks and lockdowns by accident or design?
Well, some will be by accident because there are people who are following these rules because they think they're right. And so when they have collateral damage, when people are dying of despair or overdoses, suicides, not getting the type of treatment they need in a timely fashion, missing diagnoses, not wanting to take their medicines, not going to the hospital when they're having a heart attack because they're afraid they'll get COVID if they go there. All those collateral issues could occur by accident. It's possible. You wonder how people who are experts in pandemic planning, like Dr. Tam and Dr. Henry, could miss those collateral issues when they're locking everybody down. So one does start to think, could this be by design? And if by design, what would be the reason for that? Why would you do something which could intentionally harm the citizens of your country?
Are we likely to see increased illnesses over the next year or two due to the wearing of masks?
Well, I think we've already answered that question. Yes, we're going to see if people wear masks that they're going to have more incidents of infections. They're going to have injuries. They're going to have increased dementia. We're going to see many neurological problems. We've already had 2 children die in Germany because of mask wearing, and there were 2 or 3 in China very early that died during PE classes. And So we're going to see that sort of thing, the effects of low oxygen and increased carbon dioxide. We're going to see infections due to wearing the masks themselves. We may start to see long-term lung infections due to the shredding of masks on the inside. So, yes, we're going to see more illnesses of all different types from mask wearing. But, the worst illness we're going to see is going to be the psychological illnesses that we're going to see in our children, and that they're going to be fearful. They're going to think that they themselves are the cause of everybody dying around them, particularly when, the news is keeping, talking about people dying right, left, and center. Those little children are going to have their psychological view of the world and of themselves completely warped. And that will be very hard for them to come back from. The other thing is children's brains do require oxygen, maybe more so than we as adults, but they're growing and they're learning, and that we're going to see that there's going to be a loss of the ability to learn in these children because of chronic hypoxia of the brain. But I really fear that where we're going with our children is really a very dark path, and we need to really, really think hard and try to reverse field here. And hopefully we'll get some help from our public health officials, but I don't see it coming. I see it going the worsening actually, that we're masking up, we're reducing the human contact that's so important for children, and we're telling them to stay inside, that they're pariahs, and that they're generally naturally bad. When you tell a child that you're unlovable because you're naturally bad, you can imagine what happens to their sense of self-worth and their personalities and everything that unfolds in the rest of their lives. We need to change that.
Could we be creating a whole generation of people with post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not just one generation. Generation after generation. It's going to be passed down. I think we see that with indigenous peoples, that those that went into residential schools, it's very hard that the wound that occurs in one generation gets passed down to the next generation. And if we do have grandchildren, and this plan that seems to be the agenda behind all this nonsense is carrying on, we're going to be in a lot worse shape than most of us can imagine.
People are fearful of COVID-19. They're wearing masks, social distancing, proponents of lockdowns. Will it be difficult for people to overcome these fears?
When people are frightened, they go into a type of mode which we all know as fight or flight. It's part of the brain that uses the amygdala. They're not using the cortex, so they have real difficulty thinking it through. In fact, over a period of time, if people keep getting the same message and keep believing it, and they keep having all the support such as masks around them, which again propagate that fear, then what we're going to see is people moving into a type of psychosis. Psychosis which is delusional, and that delusion is that they're in danger all the time. And so it won't be possible to talk them out of it by showing them the evidence. They'll be delusional to the point where they won't be able to take it in. Such a thing is known as wetiko, which is mind blindness in some cultures, and I think just about every group on the planet has some kind of a mind blindness disease in their lexicon that we talk about, and that's the sort of thing where you develop a loop which you can't break into it. As a doctor, if I saw someone with paranoid schizophrenia in my office and you try to tell them, reason with them that there are no aliens talking to them, you would not be able to do it because they might nod their head and say, yeah, oh yeah, right. But in fact, you cannot break into that delusion and reverse it. It's impossible. If we go to that level, we're going to have people monitoring their neighbors, and we won't need police, we won't need armies to keep us in line. People will be doing it because they feel that there's a delusion which is so strong of them being in danger that they're going to have to force their neighbors to do what they think is right to prevent them having any harm.
Sure. Didn't our grandparents storm the beaches of Normandy so people wouldn't be spying on each other and reporting them to the government?
That's exactly right, yeah. But I feel we're going down that path. And it's an intentional path that's creating this by propagating the fear and also encouraging people to trust experts. And in the medical field, we've been programmed for so many years to believe in our journals that they're accurate, that they're not affected by big pharma. We trust in our associations who are now telling doctors not to speak out against the narrative on COVID, and for fear of penalty. And we just come to trust in our experts without really examining what they're saying anymore. We have to change that. We're going to have to start rethinking things and, in fact, taking back thinking to ourselves instead of just relegating it to an expert.
We're hearing of lawsuits in the works against governments and key players in the lockdowns and the masking of people. Governments are passing laws to indemnify themselves from COVID liability. Should this be a red flag?
Of course it should be a red flag. They're trying to, they realize they're doing something wrong, and they're trying to pass laws to prevent themselves from being held accountable. It's happening in Ontario. It's probably happening in BC. It's happening all over the place. But and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say what we can and cannot do if those laws get passed. But they're not for the best of the populace. Let's face it. Our government is completely, I would say, rogue and unaccountable, and they're trying to make it more so. I don't know what their agenda is, but it's not a good one based on their actions.
A number of companies are making masks mandatory for employees and customers. Could these companies be at risk of liability if their employees or customers become ill from the wearing of masks?
Yeah, sure. They should all be sued if they're doing something which is harming their employees, and they're mandating that they wear masks, and yet those masks are causing harm. I can't imagine people developing low oxygen and then falling into a piece of machinery and losing their limbs. Think about that. I mean, I made the example of a bus driver driving kids around to school wearing a mask. Now, if that person's susceptible, let's say they have a little bit of lung disease or even a cold coming on or something that's already starting to reduce their ability to breathe easily, and now they're becoming hypoxic while wearing a mask, I wouldn't want my child on that bus. So I think this is a big issue, and the problem is that some of these companies are just doing what they're told, and they think, well, I'm being told, so I'm just going to do that. They themselves are trying to do the right thing, but the right thing as they see it is not informed by science and not informed by research. And they're just, again, relying upon the people above them. And we've heard that story before in World War II, right?
The lockdowns seem to be targeting countries in the Commonwealth, and the directives seem to be coming from the World Health Organization. Could it be time for Canada to follow the U.S. lead and leave the World Health Organization?
Absolutely. The World Health Organization is completely captured by Big Pharma, by China, by Bill Gates and his vaccine programs. We need to kick out the World Health Organization. They're not doing us any favors. They may have some programs which are good. I'm not saying that they don't, but certainly their whole COVID-19 plan and their vaccination with COVID-19 vaccines are bordering on the insane. It seems insane from our point of view, but maybe not so much for them if their agenda is really to beat down the human population and to control them, to make them do as they wish in the future, which could be cryptocurrency, global corporation control, 5G, surveillance, repeated vaccinations, and all the wealth that will come from that. Then they're doing just what they think is going to make them powerful, but it's at the cost of humanity. So yes, I think we should get rid of the World Health Organization.
Now, the most important question, what can people do to boost their immune system so they don't get COVID, the flu, or even the common cold?
Well, this is a very good question, and it is a very important one. People can do a lot. As we go into the fall, we have to realize that our nutrition will be interfered with because we need vitamin D, particularly, and that's dependent upon sunshine exposure on the skin, converting what we get in our food into the active form. So people do need to take supplements for vitamin D3. They're inexpensive, and they need to start by the third week of October. So, hey, we're into the vitamin D supplement time. I recommend for adults in Canada 4,000 international units per day, and that they have a blood test done in a couple of months to see if that's adequate, because some people don't absorb it very well, or some people require a higher amount, or their metabolism is different. And there is a range. We want to get as close to the top of the range as possible. Don't allow it just to kind of borderline into what's considered normal vitamin D level, and this will protect you from, will contribute to protecting you from infections, as well as improve your mood if you have a seasonal affective disorder. It has all sorts of effects in the human body, not just bones, but it's present in just about everything that goes on in the human. So that would be very beneficial, and you need to start taking that now and take it right through to the fall. As I mentioned before, a lot of the outcomes of COVID-19 that were bad were a result of, or at least correlated with having very low vitamin D levels. Other things we can do, we do need to, of course, make sure you get out in nature, get fresh air, get lots of sleep, eat well, good food, have friends and family around you, laugh, do all those things that are so important, and be human. Go out and hug somebody. I mean, don't hug someone if they have a bad cold and they're sneezing and all that sort of thing, but, I think we have to move back to feeling our humanity and what that means and what being a human means at its deepest level. That is being taken away from us by all these policies. For example, not having Christmas with more than just your family. You can't have your friends over, or not having a party. Wearing a mask, which also isolates you. Staying 6 feet apart, which is just a rule of thumb that was made up for spitting at people. It has nothing to do with COVID-19. So vitamin D is very important. Also, vitamin C would be important, and I personally take 1,000 milligrams once a day, but it might be worthwhile to take it twice a day, and also to increase it if you get exposed to a cold or flu or start having early symptoms. You can bump that up until you get what's known as bowel intolerance. So what you do is you take vitamin C spaced out during the day, repeated doses, and when you start to get loose stools, you cut back. And that's all that you need. Your intestinal tract will determine what you need at that time. It is a stress vitamin, so when you're under stress, your requirements go up, and in such a way, or similarly, your bowel's ability to absorb it into your body will go up as well. So Linus Pauling took 17,000 milligrams a day when he was well, and he would bump it up to 35 and above, depending on bowel tolerance when he was sick. The other things to make sure you make a good multivitamin is important, and one way of checking out when you don't know what you need is look on the back label. And if it has an element called molybdenum in it, MOLYBDENUM, then you can pretty much guarantee that that's a high-quality vitamin, that they spent enough time formulating it to put what is an essential element in it or mineral. And that's one way of looking at multivitamins. Sometimes you can't buy those in regular old drugstores, which have pretty low-quality ones and not much in them. Other things you might want to take would be some selenium, which is good for fighting off viral infections, magnesium, because it helps you to absorb and utilize vitamin D, and many Canadians are magnesium deficient. And the other one you might consider is omega-3s, because we have an imbalance of omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids in our diets. If you supplement with omega-3, you can rebalance those two, and that has some benefits for your immune system as well as other health, such as cardiovascular health. So that would be my kind of recommendations about vitamins and nutrients in a nutshell. There are other things which you can do which may depend upon you personally. We may have heard that zinc is very important in COVID infections, and the loss of sense of smell and taste are probably reflecting that people have a zinc deficiency. Hydroxychloroquine, when in my opinion, with zinc and azithromycin, is a great way of treating COVID in the early stages. It can't be used late in the game because we're beyond the viral replication phase. But zinc is 20 milligrams is usually contained in a good multivitamin, so you don't need to supplement with that. Yeah, that's my recommendations.
Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I hope it's been helpful to people.
My guest has been Dr. Stephen Malthouse. He was speaking to us from Denman Island in British Columbia. If you have any questions for our guests or for the show, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. We're also on Facebook. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated.